Okay, thanks. Next, if I could call on the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, please.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Cheyenne Arnold Cunningham, and I'm counsel for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. We've heard a lot today already on the topic of consultation, so we'd like to ask, did you consult or cooperate with local First Nations or Indigenous groups during the Freedom Convoy situation and or the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act?
I would say that I've had broad and ongoing conversations with representatives and leadership within First Nations and Indigenous communities.
First Nations are trying to prove government did not adhere to UNDRIP, which is now in effect in certain jurisdictions in the country. That's why all this, but it's not relevant to the Emergencies Act invocation itself.
That sit at the table, including Ministers Miller and Haidu, are in routine and constant engagement with First Nations and Indigenous peoples and the communities. So there's a broad range of ongoing dialogue that is undertaken by representatives of the cabinet.
Okay, thank you. From a public safety viewpoint, do you think that it's important during a public order emergency event for Public Safety Canada and police services to engage with First Nations in the local territory?
I do.
So in your mandate letter dated December 2021, you were directed to implement the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is also known as UNDRIP. Are you familiar with Bill C-15, which came into force as federal legislation in June 2021 to adopt and implement UNDRIP?
Yes, and I would just add to that that we are leveraging UNDRIP to advance important reforms within the RCMP around First Nations and Indigenous policing. And so, for example, over the last number of weeks and months in my capacity as Minister of Public Safety, I have been deeply engaged with First Nations and Indigenous and Inuit communities for the purposes of ensuring that there are more Indigenous-led public safety initiatives, including the creation of Indigenous-led police services, which are independently created. We have also are in the process of co-developing legislation that expressly recognizes that Indigenous policing is an essential service so that we can move away from the current First Nations and Indigenous policing program-based approach to one that is more structured and enduring and uses UNDRIP and the principles of reconciliation as the anchor for a relationship between the federal government and First Nations and Indigenous policing. And then the last thing I would point out is that we are currently debating Bill C-20, which is before Parliament, which is an act that would create a new Public Complaints and Review Commission, what we are referring to as the PCRC. And we are, again, very engaged with First Nations and Indigenous communities to ensure that there is representation on that commission so that there can be appropriate civilian review and accountability in the way that we police and uphold the law in Indigenous communities.
Great, thank you so much. I'll jump off the last few points that you made there. So speaking of Bill C-20 and the work that you're doing there, would you agree then that ensuring Indigenous participation and presence on oversight bodies of the RCMP as either decision makers or complaints investigators would assist in that acceleration of RCMP reform moving forward?
I agree it's essential, and that's one of the things that we talk about in our engagements, and it's one of the reasons why we are co-developing the legislation around the recognition that Indigenous policing is an essential service. And in order to give life and breath to that principle, it means being at the table together, starting from the premise that there needs to be a recognition of the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to chart out their own courses to implement their own priorities as it relates to public safety, including and leading up to Indigenous police services, which are self-governed. So both in that co-development exercise, as well as in Bill C-20, we are very much engaged with First Nations and Indigenous people so that they are reflected in our institutions, including when it comes to public safety.
What about the CSIS Act? Are there any plans to ensure modernization of this legislation in alignment with UNDRIP?
Well, the reforms that I'm carrying out in my capacity as Minister of Public Safety has, as part of the overarching mandate given to me by the Prime Minister, the need to adhere to the principles of reconciliation. And part of that is addressing long, enduring, systemic, structural challenges in the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples that go back to the origins of colonialism. And that would apply not only to RCMP and CBSA, but right across all of my line agencies, including CSIS. So we are really trying to get at some of those inherent biases which have led to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples interacting with the justice system, and using UNDRIP as well to make sure that we reduce and ultimately eliminate those barriers.
Okay, thank you. So in considering all the work that you're doing to implement UNDRIP and your mandate and Bill C-15, and another piece of your mandate, which is to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples to advance their rights. Considering UNDRIP's implementation, do you think that there should be then distinct considerations on CSIS and the RCMP and their ability to monitor and respond with enforcement action against nonviolent and unarmed First Nations people who engage in activism pertaining to their lawful and distinct rights, even in situations that might be perceived or profiled as being a public order event?
I do, and that's one of the reasons why it's really important as we implement these reforms that we modernize training to be culturally sensitive of Indigenous language, of Indigenous culture and tradition and Indigenous laws. And that is something that we are actively doing right now. And the hope is that by doing so, that we will create a relationship that is based on respect, on the nation-to-nation principles and values that are informed by UNDRIP. And again, this is not just with regards to the line agencies in my portfolio. This is work that has to be done right across our government.
Okay, thank you. And then in thinking about the practice of consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples,
you know what?
in the context
this is
of
absolutely irrelevant for the purposes of this inquiry.
A situation like the Freedom Convoy situation or public order emergency events.
I am also traveling with increasing frequency to Indigenous communities across the country to meet in person with Indigenous leaders, with residents. I recently had the chance to visit with the James Smith Cree Nation following the mass casualty there at the beginning or at the end of summer, I beg your pardon. And so that direct personal experience is meant to foster a relationship so that we can move forward with the kinds of reforms that are inspired and governed by UNDRIP and by the principles of reconciliation, which have been documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the MMIWG Calls to Justice. It's a full court press from the federal government to really move forward with those reforms, but you have to meet with people and you have to respect that inherent right of self-government and that inherent right of self-determination, and that includes when it comes to public safety initiatives. And I think by doing so, we can break that intergenerational trauma, that endless cycle that has seen a disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples caught up in the criminal justice system, for example. And so that is work that I am deeply committed to.
Thank you so much for your time today. Those are all of our questions. Thank you to the Commissioner as well.
Okay, thank you.